of the conversation tonight is which way forward. I think that's assisted, or that process is assisted by understanding what happened in the last 10 or 15 years around the climate talks, and also the climate movement. So I want to spend 6 or 7 minutes only just doing a little recap in the hope that that might be helpful for some people in the audience. The basic, let's start with a year ago. A year ago, or about 10 months ago, the Warsaw COP, the Conference of the Parties, ended in chaos when delegates from Australia and Canada were seen with their feet up on the table, wearing t-shirts, eating their lunch in the middle of profoundly moving testimony from often representatives and delegates from the global south. This was just after the disaster in the Philippines with the Yolanda, or I can't remember the other name of it, Haiyan. And it was seen to be a real affront to the whole seriousness of the challenge. And it led to a walkout of the environmental organizations and the trade unions. And it was a really significant moment to have people who've been spending a decade or more trying to work with this system to have to walk out. I'm going to read a quote here, and it is from Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the UN. He says, "What now? If governments are unwilling to lead when leadership is required, people must. We need a global grassroots movement that tackles climate change and its fallout." And if sort of fairly mainstream figures in world politics are saying that we need a people's-led climate movement, that is speaks to the seriousness of the historical period we're in and the nature of the climate challenge. But I want to just go back a little bit over the UN process over the years. Many of you know about the Kyoto Treaty, the Kyoto Protocol. Roughly about 20 or so years ago, there was an acceptance, over 20 years, 25 years ago now, there was an acceptance that the atmosphere was getting warmer, global warming was a problem, and the scientific evidence was beginning to accumulate. There was a body called the Intergovernmental on Climate Change, which was convened by the UN to gather all of the data. And there was an acceptance that certain rich countries, what was called Annex I countries, were primarily responsible for the problem and should bear the brunt of the responsibility to pursue a solution, at least in the first phase. So a treaty was negotiated called the Kyoto Treaty, which the United States did not sign on to, which basically exempted the developing world from any emissions reductions in the short term, but put all the emphasis on the developed world that was responsible for 80–90% of the emissions that were in the atmosphere already and causing global warming. Now, I want to flash forward to 2007. As it was clear that the Kyoto Protocol was going to expire in 2012, many countries in Europe had begun to more or less meet their commitments. But bear in mind, it was a 5% reduction, and it didn't have much of an impact in the overall emissions trajectory. Meanwhile, the developing countries, China, India, Brazil, Mexico, their emissions was going up very, very quickly. So the world in which the Kyoto Treaty was negotiated was not the same world as was around 2007. But I was in the room in Bali at COP13, and the assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was basically the subject of a whole day of presentations by scientists. And there were 2,000 or 3,000 people in the room, and you could have heard a pin drop, hearing one report after other: ocean acidification, glacier melt, soil degradation, coral reef bleaching. It went on and on. And of course, typically it led to a flurry of speeches from top politicians that we have to do something about climate change. And even though there was a dire scientific scenario being laid out, it also came with some certain degree of optimism. First of all, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change offered in 2007 an emissions reductions trajectory. And it was pretty scary to look at it. It was a 50% global reductions by 2050 based on 1990 levels. Bear in mind, the levels of emissions have gone up 15% from 1990 to 2007 when we were in Bali. The Other thing that came out of that process, though, was this commitment from the G8 and the G20 that they were going to reduce emissions in accordance with the science-based targets. On the other hand, there was another scientific debate going on. It says, who says that 2 degrees, or so-called 450 parts per million, was actually scientifically accurate? A lot of countries were saying 2 degrees condemns our countries, the small island nations, sub-Saharan Africa, to sorts of changes that were absolutely catastrophic. So this began to come into the debate. But generally speaking, in terms of the climate movement, which was in its infancy then, there was a sense that there was this process, the UN process, could deliver a global agreement in Copenhagen at the end of 2009. And all of the movement really, or a lot of the movement, gravitated towards that goal. So let's move forward to the 2009 COP, if I have time, Martha. I'm not sure who's keeping time, me probably. So in 2009, expectations were high, but if you read between the lines, you knew that something was wrong. Obama had been elected, and he said, we are going to engage the UN talks in a robust way. That didn't mean to say the administration was going to support an agreement, just means they were going to engage in the talks in a robust way, for what that was worth. Then you had the Stern Review. The Stern Review came out in 2006, which was called The Economics of Climate Change, and said, this is a piece of cake. Reducing emissions by this level is totally doable. We have the technology that can solve this problem. And Stern was extremely confident that this was going to happen. It was also a time when the recession was beginning to hit, and there's a sense that the sort of the more liberal wing of the capitalist elite was in the ascendancy. You had Rudd, elected Prime Minister in Australia, saying a new era of social democracy is going to be born, and this time it's going to be green. So you had a lot of optimism. But in Copenhagen, all that optimism came to naught. We saw Hillary fly in, followed by Obama. They did a deal, which I don't have time to go into detail, many of you will remember it. It was basically they huddled in the corner, they sabotaged the talks, and they came out with the Copenhagen Accord. The Accord basically said, and Todd Stern, the chief negotiator for the administration, was clear about this even before the talks. They said, we don't need a global agreement on emissions reductions. That's not possible. There are just a few emitters who add up to 80% of the emissions, and they have to get together and do what they can in a pledge and review system. We make a commitment, then we occasionally go back and see if we're meeting the commitment. That was 2009. It was catastrophic for the climate movement that hoped to get something out of Copenhagen. So here we are. The next 3 years of the Conference of the Parties around the UN produced pretty much nothing. Blah, blah, blah for 3 years, all talking about, do we need an agreement, do we not need an agreement? And then you get to a point where you have the walkout in Warsaw, which I began my comments with. So this is the kind of context. And so when Ban Ki-moon decides he's going to call a summit, of course he's not calling a march, he's calling a summit. And the idea is, let's put back on the agenda of world leaders climate protection, because it's fallen down the agenda. And what we're going to see in the summit on September 23rd, in my opinion, is nonsense. It's going to be a day's worth of fine speeches, and we need action. So this means that the march is absolutely important to show the world that the world is going to move on climate protection. But I don't have time to go into what a march means. We all have seen marches in the past. Some lead to major change, some are just another march and we all go home. It has to be in the context of building a robust, consistent movement that's grounded in education, in action, and in clarity. There will be debates inside that movement, how much we need to change the fundamental dynamics of capitalism. It's a system that's based on growth, profit, accumulation, and consumption. Can we have a system that's truly in alignment with nature, with that system in place? There's a lot of debate about that, and let's bring it on. Let's have that discussion. I actually don't think we can do that, but I believe that there's a new narrative emerging about defending the commons, about economic democracy, about democratic control over major economic decisions, and in that I take some hope.
In 1989, I think there was a meeting at the UN when Margaret Thatcher was the Prime Minister of Great Britain in regards to climate change. That was 25 years ago. And we have managed now to come to this juncture where our planet is brinking on devastation. I wanted to know, what is it going to take? What is it truly going to take for us, as the 8 billion people on this earth, to try to do something about what is happening to us?
What do we need to do? I can't remember who said that. It's actually what's the course of action? And I think my understanding of the whole discussion on climate and ecological sustainability over the last 10 years since I've been working on it is that yes, all of the technical solutions, more or less, in broad outline at least, exist. Renewable-based power, sustainable small food agriculture, small farm agriculture, different ways of doing transportation, low carbon mobility. There's loads of strategies, loads of options. The problem is when it's left to private markets and private investors to determine what options we choose, we're not going to get the ones we need, A, to reduce the emissions, B, to ensure adaptation and peace, and thirdly, we're not going to get levels of democratic input at the grassroots level and participation in economy that we need. So we really have to say solutions exist. Let's agree, let's find out what they are and build a political project, a party, a movement that actually fights for them in the electoral sphere and in the non-electoral sphere. It needs to be a multifaceted, multi-sided movement. So that's what I believe we should be sort of fighting for.
I think that, this broad tent approach is interesting in the idea that it brings together the kind of solidarity that JD's talking about, and that's critical. It's not strong right now. I think that's part of why we don't have strong demands, because we don't necessarily trust each other yet. So this is a process. This is the practice run for building more trust, building a bigger tent, building a tent with stronger demands, and recognizing that we don't have time. But it's kind of like, excuse my language, tough shit. We have to do it anyway, because we're not going to win if we don't have those relationships built. So we have to do that. We have to take the time. And while we're doing that, because it's not just one strategy over another strategy, we have to be in a stance of resistance. So that means that people have to be, I believe, that people have to be actively, potentially breaking the law to stop the kinds of pollution, to stop the kinds of building of transmission lines, to stop, kicking people off of their land, to stop land takeover. So not only we have to be building relationships, we have to be asserting our relationships with the places that we live, with the land that we live on, with our family's health. I mean, we need to be doing both at the same time.
I'm also taken by this question, which way forward, the question of the day. And I think the way to answer that is to question what is causing climate change. And the answer to that is about 2/3 of the cause of climate change is the burning of fossil fuels. And the next largest percentage is agricultural causes, especially related to the production of food for meat consumption. Not just in this country, but increasingly in Asia. So basically, we will not stop climate change until we stigmatize the consumption of fossil fuels. And there is no shortcut to that. There is no alternative to that. There is no other way. The only way to stop climate change is to reduce and eventually eliminate the consumption of fossil fuels. So the strategy has to be to demonize, to stigmatize the consumption of climate change, and I think at some point the overconsumption of meat. Now we could talk about that. That is what is causing climate change, and you're not going to stop climate change until you eliminate those emissions. There is no other way. Now let me say more about this. It is not just, Western privatized corporations that are pushing this. Let's get real. It is state-owned companies, more even than private companies. It is the China National Petroleum Corporation, Sinopec, Gazprom, Rosneft, the Indian Oil and Natural Gas Corporation, Saudi Aramco, the Venezuelan PDVSA, and many other companies that are pushing this. Socialist, communist companies, Petro Vietnam, are equally involved in pushing fossil fuels on all of us. So until we make it unacceptable around the world to produce and to consume fossil fuels, we will not stop climate change. So you have to look at this like tobacco. like slavery. Those are the models that we have to look at, where it is unacceptable to put gasoline in your gas tank. And let me tell you, I did that today. So to come here from Massachusetts, took a train half the way, but there is no public transit from where I live to here. We have to eliminate the use of gasoline, of coal, of natural gas. There is no other way. So we have to build a movement to demonize, stigmatize, prohibit the consumption of those materials. And that has to be the way to do it. That's why I support the movement of divestment of fossil fuels. My college, Hampshire College, has divested. We're pushing that at my other member schools, Smith, Amherst, UMass, Mount Holyoke, and hundreds of other schools are pushing that because that says the problem is fossil fuels. These are dirty. These are contemptible. All these schools don't have tobacco stocks. They wouldn't dream of having tobacco stocks because that would blemish their reputation. That's the way this has to be presented. This is like slavery, like owning slaves. That's the way we have to go. So.
I think it is possible to win reforms. I think the brother who talked about the fact that he doesn't believe that it's possible for us to make any significant difference or change under capitalism. You may be right, but the problem is so severe at this point. We are so close to the tipping point, as the brother over here talked about, is that we have no other choice. It would be years ago it would be impossible for many of us to, well, I don't want to go back as far as slavery, but we could talk about the rights of gay people to marry. We could talk about cigarettes, the sales of cigarettes and tobacco. I know I was talking not too long ago to someone who called himself an eco-socialist. He said, look, you can do all you want about this whole climate change thing, but nothing's going to change until we have socialism. And I said,
That's not what I'm saying. That's
Oh.
not what I'm saying. That's not how you work.
oh, okay, all right. The point I'm saying is that the problem is so severe. We have to build the capacity to build a movement that's broad enough, deep enough, strong enough to begin to still the hand of the corporations and the governments who are pushing fossil fuel. And I don't think there's nothing else we can do. We have to fight for these reforms. We can fight for socialism, as an ultimate goal, but we cannot wait on socialism. It'd be like telling anyone, oh, you're not going to be liberated, you're not going to be free, you're not going to have your rights until we change the system. Yeah, I believe the system needs to be changed, but I believe there's things we have to do within that system, and in fighting for those changes within it, people might then begin to see that we have to go beyond that.
Transport-based emissions is the fastest growing form of greenhouse gas emissions. But 75 to 80% of it is cars and trucks. And there's 60 million vehicles a year being produced right now. It stands to go up. And they're lasting longer. They may be more fuel efficient, but that doesn't matter. If you're bringing 60 million new ones and you're only retiring 30 million or scrapping 30 million, you've got a problem. And so there's a lot of environmentalists like to focus on air travel, and it's a big, serious problem. And it's growing 5% a year on average, before the recession anyway. So I think all of this requires a mapping of where the emissions come from, what are the solutions, and how do we politically organize around making sure the solutions are administered. And the other quick point I would make on, this idea of system change and revolution, I'm totally with the program, don't get me wrong. But we have an economy that's been built up on fossil fuels for the last 150 plus years. And to get from where we are now to where we need to go takes planning, coordination, democratic input, and we can't just rely on slogans, leave the oil in the soil and the coal in the hole. That's very, very important as an organizing tool, but we need a program, we need a plan, and it may sound very old left and old school, but I think that's absolutely what we need. A sort of a socialist transitional program to make sure we move to where we need to be. So.
I'd like to sovereignty movement globally. Here, we call it the food justice movement. People sort of minimize its importance. But globally, it's one of the largest people's movements, poor people's movements in the world. 250 million members of La Via Campesina in about 100 countries. So I'd like you to talk about that also in terms of what Michael was suggesting around land and water struggles. In my travels, visiting food sovereignty projects in the Global South, they are the people themselves who are engaged in these projects are totally aware, live climate change every single day, and they're very anti-capitalist, and they're very, very, very poor. So I'd like to hear how we in the Global North can relate to that movement in the Global South and bring it together as a climate change project.
One thing we haven't spoken about that much yet is something that is a concern of mine is overconsumption, not just of meat, but in general. So many of our cheap goods are produced now in China. That's why China is now the #1 emitter of CO2, because that's where our clothes are being manufactured, the plastic goods are being manufactured, our electronics. Every year you have to get a new iPhone, every year you want to get a new whatever, something, pair of shoes. And how do we have strategies to tackle that? I mean, in the developed countries, I know developing countries, only the very rich can consume a lot, but I think they want to go there, and how do we address that? Because consumption, that is the engine of the current economy. Consume more and more, everything has to be more, and how do we reverse that? Because we cannot keep doing it.
I just wanted to speak to the issue of China that came up, because as the questioner correctly pointed out, China is now the biggest emitter of carbon dioxide and climate greenhouse gases. And as the commenter made correctly, a lot of that is our own exported emissions, because we buy things from there. By the way, the U.S. coal industry is also exporting coal to China and wants to do more of that. And natural gas, when the fracking industry is able to get permission to build more LNG terminals to export LNG, natural gas from fracking, they want to sell it to China. So we will be exporting, so that has to be part of the struggle too. But this goes back to what JJ was saying about solidarity, because if we're going to stop climate change, the most important force in the world is going to be the Chinese people, not us. They're the ones who are going to have to stop this, because their government is now the leading force behind climate change, not us anymore. Sad to say, this is nominally communist government. I agree that it is a communist government with capitalist tendencies, but nonetheless, there you have it. That's a dilemma that we have to face. But the Chinese people, if you talk to them, that is not the ones in power, but the ones who struggle to breathe every day, are immensely aware of the price they pay for fossil fuel-driven growth. And they're increasingly prepared to erupt in mass protests, which we rarely hear about, but which bring tens of thousands of people in the streets daily in China. And this is where we have to have solidarity, is global solidarity of the climate action, anti-fossil fuel movement. That is the answer, ultimately.
This is a strange time in terms of, it's the worst of times, which I hate to be Dickensian about this, but it is the opposition against anything. We're talking about the future of the planet, the future of human civilization. It's the biggest challenge the human species have ever faced. We know the enemy is stronger than it's ever been, and yet we also know that people are talking about it in ways that they wouldn't have done a few years ago, that we are talking about system change. We are talking about build a movement. This will be the next great movement. And the future of the human civilization will depend on whether we're successful or not. So let's all get involved in the struggle, have a good time, and make sure we win in the end of the day, because we just have to. It's as simple as that.
2 years ago, when I became involved with the fracking movement, nobody in fracking was talking about climate change. Not a word. All they cared about was drilling and get rid of these oil rigs all over my land and all the rest of it. Now they are all talking about climate change. Everybody is. And I think I see this movement developing, but where we're going to see the real fire of the movement will be, as Samir Amin says, in the periphery, not in the center. We will learn from the periphery. We will see, just as it was the slaves who made slavery impossible, and the black people of the United States who rose up against Jim Crow, and the women who demanded power, and the gays, one group after another. We're going to see it from the developing nations. We're going to see it from the poor, because they are the ones whose backs are to the wall. One final note on hope. Those who follow my Facebook page know that I have a thing about monarch butterflies, which are 90% extinct at this point. And I started a movement to plant swampweed, milkweed. And I just want to announce that today I saw my 4th monarch butterfly.